Hi, I'm Sarah Mitchell, and this is the story of how my own brother's greed destroyed our family, and how karma finally caught up with him. Growing up, my brother James and I were close, or at least I thought we were. He was 4 years older, charming, and always seemed to know exactly what to say to get his way. Our parents adored him, especially our father, who saw James as the perfect heir to his business empire. I was different. While James pursued an MBA and dreamed of taking over our father's company, I chose to study marine biology. My passion for ocean conservation didn't exactly align with my father's vision of business success, but my mother always supported my choices. "Follow your heart, Sarah," she'd say, her gentle smile giving me the courage to pursue my dreams. Life was relatively peaceful until that fateful day 3 years ago, and our parents' private jet crashed during a business trip to Singapore. The news devastated us. James and I clung to each other during the funeral, both of us struggling to process the magnitude of our loss. Little did I know that behind his grief-stricken facade, my brother was already plotting to take everything for himself. Our father had built a remarkable business empire worth over $5 million, and his will was clear. The inheritance was to be split equally between James and me. While James would take over the company operations, I would receive my fair share of the assets, including our family's beachfront property, where I planned to establish a marine research center, a dream I'd shared with my father before his death. "Your passion for marine conservation is admirable," he had told me during our last conversation. "Sometimes the greatest legacy isn't just about money, but about making a difference in the world." Those words meant everything to me, and I was determined to honor his memory through my work. The first few weeks after the funeral were a blur of paperwork and legal meetings. James insisted on handling all the arrangements, claiming he wanted to spare me the stress. "Trust me, little sister," he said, his hand on my shoulder. "I'll take care of everything." His words seemed sincere, and in my grief-stricken state, I was grateful for his help. That was my first mistake. One morning, I arrived at our family home to find James in our father's study, surrounded by documents. His expression was different, colder, more calculated. "We need to talk about the inheritance," he said, not looking up from the papers. "There have been some complications." I sat down, my heart racing. What complications? The will was clear about everything being split equally. James finally looked at me, his eyes hard. "The company's in trouble, Sarah. Dad left some significant debts that need to be handled. We can't split the assets right now. It would destroy everything he built." "But what about my share? The beachfront property?" My voice trembled slightly. "I need it for the research center." He laughed, a sharp, dismissive sound that made me flinch. "A research center? Really, Sarah? This is business, not some environmental charity project. The property is worth too much to waste on your little marine biology dreams." His words stung, but I stood my ground. "That's not your decision to make, James. The will. The will has been amended," he cut in, sliding a document across the desk. "Dad made some changes before the accident. Everything goes to me now." I stared at the paper, my hands shaking as I read. Something felt wrong. The signature looked off, the wording too convenient. "This can't be real," I whispered. "It is," James said coldly. "And as the sole heir, my first decision is to sell the beachfront property. You have 1 week to move out of your apartment. It's company property now." The room spun as the full impact of his words hit me. Not only was he stealing my inheritance, but he was also taking away my home. "You can't do this," I said, my voice stronger now. "I'll fight you in court." James stood up, towering over me. "With what money? Face it, Sarah, you're too naive to handle this kind of wealth. I'm doing you a favor. Besides," he smirked, "who do you think the board will believe? The experienced CEO or the little sister who spends her time playing with fish?" Tears burned in my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. "You'll regret this, James. What you're doing isn't just illegal. It's cruel." He walked to the door, then turned back with a cold smile. "Cruel? This is business, dear sister. Now, I suggest you start packing. Oh, and don't bother trying to contact our family lawyer. He works for me now." I left the house in a daze, my world crumbling around me. The brother I thought I knew was gone, replaced by someone I barely recognized. But as I drove away from the only home I had ever known, a determination grew within me. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The next few days were a nightmare of frantic packing and desperate phone calls. Most of our family friends suddenly became unavailable when I reached out for help. James had already spread his version of events, painting me as an irresponsible sibling trying to sabotage the family business. I managed to find a small studio apartment on the outskirts of town, all I could afford on my marine researcher's salary. As I moved my belongings into the tiny space, I couldn't help but think about the beachfront property that should have been mine. The research center I planned would have made a real difference, protecting endangered marine species and educating the next generation of conservationists. But James hadn't just stolen my inheritance, he'd stolen my dream. The amended will look suspicious, but without money for legal fees or access to the original documents, I had no way to prove it. My brother had thought of everything, using his business acumen to strip me of not just my wealth, but my dignity. Little did he know, though, that his perfect plan had one fatal flaw. He'd underestimated my resilience. As I sat in my cramped new apartment that first night, I made a promise to myself. This wasn't the end of my story. It was just the beginning. I started documenting everything, gathering whatever evidence I could. James might have the money and connections, but I had something he'd never understood: patience. And sometimes the most devastating revenge isn't something you plan. It's something you watch unfold, one piece at a time. The wheels of justice might turn slowly, but they turn inevitably. And my brother was about to learn that some things in life are worth more than money, like the trust he'd so carelessly destroyed. Living in my tiny studio apartment, I threw myself into my work at the marine research facility. My colleagues noticed the change in me. I was the first to arrive and the last to leave, taking on extra projects and working weekends. Not just because I needed the money, but because I needed to keep my mind focused. Every time I thought about James living in our family mansion, enjoying the wealth he'd stolen from me, it felt like a knife twisting in my gut. One evening, while analyzing some water samples, my colleague Maria stopped by my station. "Sarah, have you seen this?" She held up her tablet, showing a business news article. The headline made my heart skip: Mitchell Industries faces investigation over financial irregularities. I quickly scanned the article. Apparently, some of the company's recent acquisitions had raised red flags with regulatory authorities. James was quoted dismissing the concerns as routine oversight. But there was something in his carefully worded statement that caught my attention. He seemed nervous. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about our father's company and how James had claimed there were debts to handle. What if there was more to the story? I opened my laptop and began digging through public records and news archives, looking for anything unusual in the company's recent history. Hours turned into days as I pieced together a disturbing pattern. Since taking over, James had been making increasingly risky investments, leveraging company assets in ways that didn't quite add up. The amendment to our father's will hadn't just given him my inheritance, it had given him the freedom to gamble with our family's entire legacy. My breakthrough came from an unexpected source. One morning, I received an email from Patricia, our father's former secretary. She'd been let go shortly after James took over, but she kept copies of some interesting documents. "Your father would be heartbroken to see what's happening," she wrote. "Maybe these will help." The attachments confirmed my suspicions. James hadn't just forged the amendment to the will, he'd been cooking the company's books for months before our parents' death. The debts he'd mentioned were real, but they were his doing, not our father's. He'd needed my inheritance to cover his tracks and keep his scheme going. With trembling hands, I called Robert Chen, an old family friend who happened to be one of the city's top forensic accountants. "This is serious, Sarah," he said after reviewing the documents. "If what these numbers suggest is true, your brother's not just committing fraud, he's built a house of cards that could collapse any day." I felt a mix of vindication and sadness. What should I do? "Be careful," Robert warned. "James won't go down without a fight. Let me make some discreet inquiries. In the meantime, document everything and don't let him know you're onto him." The next few weeks were tense. I maintained my routine at the research facility while Robert worked behind the scenes. James, meanwhile, seemed to be living his best life. Social media showed him at charity galas and business functions, always with a practiced smile and his trophy wife, Victoria, by his side. Then came the day that changed everything. I was leaving work when I got an urgent call from Robert. "Sarah, you need to see this. Can you come to my office now?" 20 minutes later, I sat in his plush office as he explained what he'd found. James hadn't just been mismanaging the company, he'd been systematically looting it, using a network of shell companies to hide his activities. The regulatory investigation was just the tip of the iceberg. The company's worth a fraction of what everyone thinks, Robert explained, spreading documents across his desk. James has been maintaining a facade, but it's all smoke and mirrors. When this hits the fan, and it will, it's going to be spectacular. I stared at the evidence before me, my mind racing. What are my options? Robert leaned back in his chair. We could take this to the authorities right now. But given the complexity of the fraud, it might take months for them to build a case. Or, he paused, a slight smile playing at his lips, we could let nature take its course. Your brother's scheme is already starting to unravel. Sometimes the best revenge is just watching someone's lies catch up with them. I thought about James's smug face the day he kicked me out, about all the dreams he'd stolen from me. How long? Based on these numbers, 3 months max, before it all falls apart. Unless he finds a major investor to bail him out, but given the regulatory scrutiny, that's unlikely. As I drove home that night, I felt strangely calm. For months, I'd been living with the pain of betrayal, the anger of injustice. Now finally I could see light at the end of the tunnel. But I also knew that what was coming wouldn't just affect James, it would impact hundreds of employees who depended on the company for their livelihoods. I spent the next few days putting together a plan. With Robert's help, I quietly reached out to key board members, sharing just enough information to make them start asking questions. I also anonymously tipped off several business journalists about potential irregularities in the company's recent dealings. The dominoes began to fall faster than anyone expected. Major clients started pulling their contracts, citing concerns about financial stability. The stock price began to slide. James appeared on business news channels, desperately trying to project confidence, but the cracks in his facade were showing. One evening, as I watched him stumble through another defensive interview, my phone rang. It was Victoria, James's wife. Her voice was shaking. Sarah, I know we've never been close, but something's wrong with James. He's acting erratic, drinking constantly. Last night, he was up at 3 a.m., shredding documents in his office. I'm scared. I listened silently, remembering how Victoria had stood by James's side when he'd thrown me out, how she'd enjoyed the lifestyle my stolen inheritance had helped fund. Why are you telling me this? She took a shaky breath. Because I found something in those shredded documents. Something about your father's will. Sarah, I think James did something terrible, and it's all about to come out. As I hung up, I felt no satisfaction in her fear. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about justice. And justice, I was learning, had a way of arriving exactly when it was meant to. The next morning, I woke up to dozens of missed calls and a breaking news alert that would change everything. Mitchell Industries CEO steps down amid financial crisis. Company faces bankruptcy. The house of cards was finally collapsing, and James was about to learn the true cost of his betrayal. The morning after the news broke, I arrived at my research facility to find the parking lot swarming with reporters. Word had gotten out that the disgraced CEO's sister worked there, and everyone wanted a comment. I drove past them, keeping my face neutral. Let them speculate, I had work to do. Inside, my phone wouldn't stop buzzing with notifications. Mitchell Industries stock had plummeted 78% in a single day. The board had called an emergency meeting. Federal investigators were raiding the company offices, but the message that caught my attention was from Robert. Turn on the news. Now. I huddled with my colleagues around the break room TV, watching my brother's world implode in real time. James stood outside the company headquarters, his perfectly tailored suit now wrinkled, his face ashen. Reporters shouted questions as security escorted him to his car. Mr. Mitchell, is it true you forged your father's will? What happened to the missing $50 million? Did you knowingly defraud investors? James looked nothing like the confident businessman who had thrown me out months ago. His eyes were wild, desperate. As he pushed through the crowd, he spotted a camera and grabbed it, speaking directly into the lens. This is all a misunderstanding. The company is solid. We just need time to explain. My sister, she's behind this somehow. She's always been jealous of my success. I couldn't help but laugh at the irony. For months, I dreamed of exposing his crimes. But in the end, his own actions had brought him down. The regulatory investigation had uncovered far more than even I had known about. shell companies, falsified documents, and millions in misappropriated funds. That evening, as I sat in my small apartment watching the coverage, my doorbell rang. I opened it to find Victoria standing there, mascara streaked down her face. "They've frozen all our accounts," she said, her voice trembling. He's not himself. He's drinking, talking crazy. I didn't know where else to go. I studied the woman who had stood silently by while my brother destroyed my life. "What do you want from me, Victoria?" "Help," she whispered. "Please. I know we don't deserve it, but James is talking about running. He has a private plane fueled and ready. He says he has accounts overseas that the authorities can't touch." My heart raced. This was the moment of truth, the chance to either help my brother escape justice or ensure he faced the consequences of his actions. I picked up my phone and called Robert. Within hours, the authorities had James in custody at a private airfield. The overseas accounts Victoria mentioned provided the final evidence needed to charge him with multiple counts of fraud and embezzlement. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of legal proceedings and revelations. The amended will was proven fake, and with Robert's help, I was able to reclaim my rightful inheritance. But the victory felt hollow. Our family's legacy was in shambles. Hundreds of employees were losing their jobs, and my only brother was facing serious prison time. 1 month after his arrest, I visited James in jail. He sat across from me in an orange jumpsuit, his expensive haircut growing out, dark circles under his eyes. "Why did you come?" he asked, not meeting my gaze. "Because we're still family," I replied, and I needed to understand why. He laughed bitterly. "Why? Because I was drowning, Sarah. The company was struggling before Dad died. I made some bad investments, tried to cover them up. When the will gave you half the assets, I panicked. I couldn't let you walk away with your share while I dealt with the mess. You could have told me the truth. We could have faced it together." Together. He finally looked at me. "You were always the good one, Sarah. Dad's precious marine biologist, wanting to save the world. Do you know how hard it was living up to his expectations? Being the perfect businessman he wanted me to be." I felt a mix of pity and anger. "So you destroyed everything he built?" "I destroyed everything," he admitted, his voice breaking. "The company, our family, my life. And for what? To prove I could handle it all myself." Standing up, I placed my hand against the glass partition between us. "Goodbye, James. I hope you find peace with yourself someday." As I walked out of the prison, I felt lighter somehow. The truth was out, justice had been served, and I could finally move forward with my life. 3 months later, I stood on the beachfront property that had started it all. Construction crews were busy transforming the area into the marine research center I'd always dreamed of building. The Mitchell Marine Conservation Institute would be my parents' true legacy, not a testament to greed and betrayal, but to preservation and hope. Robert joined me, watching the sunset over the water. "How does it feel?" he asked. I smiled, thinking about the journey that had brought me here. "Bittersweet. I got everything I wanted, but at what cost?" "You didn't cause this, Sarah. James made his choices." "I know. I watched as workers installed the Institute's sign, featuring a sea turtle logo my father had once admired, but sometimes winning feels a lot like losing." The Institute opened 6 months later, dedicated to researching and protecting marine life along our coast. James watched the opening ceremony on the small TV in his prison common room, or so I heard from Victoria, who had divorced him and moved away to start fresh. As for me, I found peace in knowing that while money and power can corrupt, they can also be used for good. My brother's betrayal had taught me that true wealth isn't measured in dollars or property. It's measured in the impact we have on the world around us. Every morning, as I walk into the Institute and see young researchers passionate about marine conservation, I think about my father's last words to me about making a difference in the world. In the end, that's exactly what I did, just not in the way any of us expected. The Mitchell name now stands for something different in our community, not the cautionary tale of corporate greed and family betrayal that made headlines, but a symbol of environmental stewardship and redemption. And maybe that's the greatest revenge of all, not destroying my brother's world, but building something better from its ashes.